We are now ready to reassemble the transmission. I have the case all clean and prepped, ready to go. So I cleaned up my workspace and I got out the first few parts that I'm going to need for reassembly. Pay close attention when you install the idler shaft that the notch in the shaft is oriented correctly. This shaft has a little line on the back that helps you know when it's straight up and down. That is what accepts this locking tab. And the reason that's important is because the other shaft also has a notch in it, and they have to fit together perfectly like that, and they're at a bit of an angle and go in the transmission like that. So if you have one of these rotated like that, this locking tab isn't going to go in correctly. And once they're in and seated all the way, you'll have to drive them out to turn them. So you don't want to do that. So just watch as you install them. Make sure they are parallel to each other, and will allow this tab to go in. Let's get on with it. So take your gear. I have this full of good clean oil, and we want to keep everything lubricated and nice and slippery as it goes together. So the gear, this is the back of the transmission. The flat side of the gear goes in this little slot, and then simply slide your reverse idler shaft in, keeping in mind where that tab is going to go. So you can kind of hold it like this and get your head down here. It's hard with the camera, and that looks really good. I'm not going to put it in the whole way right now. I'm just going to tap it about like that until I get my other shaft in. That way, if I do have to turn it a little bit, I'll be good to go. Everything is done from the back of the case now as we drive forward. Now it's time to start assembling the main shaft. This is not complicated at all. It's going to be the same procedure as it came apart. So we're going to start with the back end. That would be the threaded portion. First thing that you're going to put on is the bearing spacer. So that just drops down. We're going to reuse the same spacer that was originally on this main shaft. Then we're going to take our rear bearing. It'll slide down part of the way, and then it's going to hit the pressed on portion of the shaft. If you have a press, that's a great way to do this. I do have a press, but I've found this way to be just as effective. So get something soft. It can be a block of wood. I'm going to use a piece of aluminum, and just simply set it on there and take your hammer, and we're just going to seat this bearing on the shaft. Try not to hit your threads, and I just kind of alternate all around. A large socket will work here, but these are I think it's 7/8 threads, so it's pretty hard to find a socket large enough to clear that, and we don't want to damage those threads. So just keep whacking it. It's not a very tight pressed fit. Just evenly go down around it, and you'll see it slowly starting to close that gap. There should be no play on this spacer. When that stops spinning, that means you're where you need to be. Only took a few more whacks, and now you can see this spacer won't turn. Bearing seated all the way down on there. They're looking good. The next thing we're going to put on is the bearing retainer. This is the piece that goes on the back of the transmission, kind of fills that hole. It goes on like this, so that the flat portion is facing the back. So it has this little rounded face that faces inside the transmission. Okay, after that step, we're going to add first gear. It goes on like this with the shift rail slot facing upward. So that should be facing the front of the input shaft, or the main shaft, just like that. Up next, still working from the top, we're going to need the lovely second gear. So I'm putting a little more oil on this. Second gear has a bushing on the inside. So it goes with the blocking synchronizer portion facing upward. So it should look just like that. I'm going to take off the blocking ring as well. You don't want that to be dry when you start spinning things on here. So second gear, blocking ring, This is what it currently looks like. Yours should look the exact same. Then after that, you're going to take the synchronizer hub assembly. If you buy the kit that we're showing in this video, part number T90K, this comes already assembled, which is a huge bonus. Will save you quite a bit of time. So simply line the splines up on this little fella and slide it down onto the shaft. The last step for assembling the main shaft would be to put the snap ring on the top. So as you can see, the snap ring groove is not exposed right now. So you need to put a little down pressure, not on the outside, but on the inside, because we don't want this shift collar to move. So I'm putting pressure on the inside and I'm spinning second gear because we need these little shift dogs to line up. There we go. And lock it in gear like that. So now you can see everything's pushed back and this snap ring groove is exposed. So now we're ready to put the snap ring on in that little groove. Your kit will come with 2 snap rings. Don't worry, you won't mix them up because the larger one will slide right down over that without even having to expand it. So this is the smaller of the snap rings, but it's pretty much impossible to mix them up because the other one won't even stay on there. So get your snap ring pliers out and wrestle this little guy on there. Snap ring is on. Now this main shaft is completely assembled and ready to go in. We're going to set it to the side and put the counter shaft in next. So second gear should move freely, and the synchronizer assembly hub, as you line these up, should be able to click and hold in place as you shift through the different gears. Up next is everybody's favorite part, little needle bearings. So there are 88 total bearings. There's 2 rows on each end of the counter shaft with this spacer in the middle and washers dividing each row of needles. So I have them counted out into little cups with 22 needles in each cup. You will get plenty of extra with your kit in case you drop them, but this just helps me keep everything organized. I have an old counter shaft here that is cut down to the exact length of the cluster gear so that we can pack this whole thing with bearings, set it in the case, and then push the new shaft through, hopefully without losing any of the bearings. So there's lots of different ways you can do this. Some people just pack grease inside the cluster gear and just pray they stay in there. I've seen different height spacers being used, but today we're going to go with the little rubber band method on an old piece of counter shaft. You can use anything that's 3/4 inch in diameter, whether it's a little piece of pipe, broom handle or wooden dowel, or any other piece of material. I'm just using an old counter shaft because it's what I have here and it's the perfect diameter for the spacer and everything else that we need. So this is a tedious task. I'm going to show you the first row and then kind of speed it up and get through to where we start packing the cluster gear. Definitely a process where you could use a few extra hands, but just take your time and be patient and you'll be fine. So start with one of your new washers, slide it down here, put a rubber band over the shaft. Then I'm going to use a little pick to kind of just hold under the rubber band, get one of the cups, and this is pretty self-explanatory. You're just going to start feeding the bearings. Once you get one started, you might not need the pick. So you're just sneaking each one under the rubber band with a washer behind it. As you start to build up and get more of them, it becomes a little bit easier to get it under the rubber band. The main thing is that you keep it from doing this while you're putting them in there. If you use a wooden dowel, This is a little bit easier because it's not so slippery. Here we have the first row done. So you can see I have 22 needles, a washer on the bottom, washer on the top. Then I have another rubber band here for the next row. So there's 2 rows on each end with the spacer in the middle. Just take your time, keep your hand under here, and the washers will keep the needles from pushing through. So I'm gonna stop here and get the other 3 rows done, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's all done. Here is the loaded counter shaft. So you can see I have all 4 rows of needles. There is a washer on each side, so we have 3 washers on that side, 3 on that side, and then the spacer in the middle. I used a little bit of grease only on the ends just to keep the washers in place. So we'll load up the cluster gear and set this in, and then we'll be cooking right along. So hopefully this works, and as you slide it in, I'll cut those rubber bands off. I'll try to show that in the video, and then you don't have to worry about anything falling out of place, because this shaft will stay in there as we push the actual shaft through. That's the plan. Now comes the scary part. We have to put this all together inside this cluster gear without having any needle bearings going flying. So keep your hand on the back of the shaft holding that washer. That will prevent anything from getting pushed off the end. So I'm just going to use these little scissors to kind of cut the rubber bands, or at least hook them and pull them back. So make sure they're well on their way into the gear before you pull the rubber bands off. So far so good. The biggest trouble I'm having was cutting the rubber bands, so I just got a razor blade. So I have the first few rows in, and I haven't lost any yet. Last 2 rows are starting, so I'm going to push that rubber band back, and these little bracelet bands, I guess is what they are pretty darn tough. Oof. So that's really this is a new method for me. So far the only problem I've had is just cutting these silly little bands. There we go. We're on the home stretch, so now I can feel the other end starting to come through, and boom, flip it up so I can push it up and pull the top washer off. Yep, they're all in there. They're in the right spot. I cut this shaft so it's just below flush on the end, so that the washers so that I'm not going to hold the washers on here. I want to be able to slide this right down. On the back side of the counter shaft is a thrust washer with 2 little kind of tabs that locate it. And you'll notice the front of the gear has matching little tabs. So I have a little grease on there. The copper side goes towards the transmission case, or brass, I guess, and a little bit of grease will hold that on there. And you want to make sure that your shaft doesn't fall out. So always support it with one hand when you are lifting it up. Then on the transmission case side, there's another washer with a little tab, and I'll show you where that goes in a moment. Then on the front side, where the larger gear is, you have a larger thrust washer with a little tab, and there is a notch inside the transmission case that locates this little tab. So I'm going to prep the transmission case by putting a little bit of grease down in here. There's a very large slot in the case where this little tab will go. It's kind of hard to miss. It's towards the top. So it should just look something like that. And you always want to make sure the brass side is facing the surface that's going to be spinning. So the tab holds this in place and the gear spins onto it. Now on the back side of the case, on the So it'd be the transfer case side. This tabbed washer, we're gonna throw some grease on it. And that goes in right down here by the reverse idler. Not sure if you can see all the way in there. It's right there with the tab facing upward. Right in the back of the transmission. Now comes the intimidating part. We have to set everything together, set the cluster gear in here without losing any of the washers or bearings. I'm going to take a little piece of a shaft here and feed it in the front to hold that front washer in place. You have to make sure it doesn't protrude past the washer at all, because then the gear won't fall in. And then in the back, I'm going to take another piece, a leftover piece of the counter shaft, and put that in the hole, and that will hold that back washer in place. And then I'm going to carefully, so I still have the thrust washer on here, I'm going to put a little bit of oil on it just to help it slide, and a little bit of oil on the front. And so remember, this is the front of the transmission. That's where the larger gear goes, and I'm going to support this back part with my hand to make sure that none of the bearings fall out, and just carefully set it down in here, making sure that the washers all stay where they belong. Counter shaft is all done, so the case is pretty much ready for the main shaft. So next we're going to prep the input shaft to get ready to install that in the case. Your kit comes with a splash washer, a little splash shield for the input shaft. So from the front, it's going to go on first, just like this. And it has a slight recess that just fits around the outer diameter of this input gear. So you want to make sure that the recess is facing this way. I'm trying to show it on camera as best as I can. So just like that. It's recessed for the gear. After that, you're going to take your input bearing, it's the front bearing, so the snap ring groove faces up. So that would go up towards the top. Slide that down over, and then I'm going to set down a block of wood. Just as with the other bearing, these don't go on very hard, so just slowly go around. You get it seated all the way until the washer doesn't spin anymore. So the washer's tight, the bearing still moves freely, and it's seated all the way down far enough to get our snap ring on the front of the input shaft. So our next step is going to be to take this large snap ring. You don't need any tools for this, just get one end started and work your way around. Wish they were all that easy. So now here's what it looks like. So we have the washer, snap ring, bearing, good to go. So the countershaft gear is sitting down in there. Our washers are in the correct location. But before we put in our actual countershaft, remember it just has that short one in there holding all the needles together, we have to put in the input shaft. That has to be done before we raise the countershaft gear up. It's just sitting about a 1/2 inch lower than it needs to be. So that's our next step. So to put the input shaft in, I just put a little bit of oil on the outer race of the bearing. You don't have to do this, I just found it sometimes fights you a little bit less. And simply guide it in. This should just be able to be wiggled in like that. Okay, so now that spins freely. We can throw a little bit of oil in there just to make me feel better. And now we're ready to raise that cluster gear up and put the actual countershaft in. So now we're going to come from the back side, and you can kind of reach in here and just look in the hole, and you'll feel it. You shouldn't have to drive this in. You should be able to just get it started by hand. Okay, and make sure it's raised up. Now's a good time to turn everything and make sure nothing is binding. Your reverse idler should spin and the input shaft should spin the cluster gear easily. So now we're just going to continue to wiggle and spin and check things as we go. Try not to lose any of those bearings. Should not have to use much more force than just your hand or maybe a light tap with a rubber mallet. So you can see as I'm pushing this one in, the other one is being pushed out, and that's what we want. As we get close to the end, check your locking tab, make sure it's parallel with the other one. This one spins a little, so right now I can still adjust it. This one is kind of locked in place. So now is our time to make any final adjustments. As you get to about the last 1/4 inch or so, it's going to get hard, and that's good because it's supposed to kind of seat firmly into the front of that case. Up next, we're going to prep the input shaft for the main shaft. So your kit will come with these larger roller bearings, and this is pretty easy compared to what we did with the cluster gear. So making sure everything's still spinning nice. For this, all you're going to do is just take some regular grease and line the inside of your input shaft with a pretty generous helping of grease, and one at a time just load them into the input shaft. So you can do this before you put the input shaft in the case, but a lot of times when you're tapping it in, they'll just fall out anyway. So I just kind of wait until now. You have plenty of room to get in from the end or the top, and just get them all in there. There should be no gap when, to make sure you have every single bearing in there. It should be a perfect circle of bearings. If you drop one down in the transmission, don't get too stressed. Just grab a magnet or shake it upside down and drop it out. So I'm gonna just take a minute, put those in, and then we'll be moving on. As we prep to install the main shaft, take your input shaft and give it a wiggle, and you'll see it pull out from the snap ring. The more space we have in here to do this, the easier it's gonna go. So just give it a little wiggle. You might gain 1/8 of an inch or so and spin it around. If this is all the way in tight, you might have a little trouble, but I left this locking plate out just a tiny bit because this bearing retainer does slide in behind it. So take this shift collar and slide it forward as much as you can without it actually coming off of the hub. That'll give us a little more room to get it down inside here. Make sure your blocking ring is on your input shaft, and now it's just kind of a wiggling act, and kind of learn as you go here. Make sure you have a lot of grease in there so you don't dislodge any of the bearings, and you have to get first gear past that reverse idler, and you should start to feel it drop down in here at some point. And we'll just keep wiggling this. Once you have to get this clutch hub past second gear down on the counter shaft, and then it'll drop in and allow you to line it up. I had to pop it back out and give myself a little more room, so I have this slid way far forward, but be careful. If I go much more, it's going to, these springs are gonna come undone, and then that's a whole nother problem we want to avoid. So just slide it forward as much as you can, because you need every little inch possible to get this to drop down in where it needs to be. There we go. And you'll feel it go into its home. Make sure your bearing retainer in the back is dropping down. And just kind of pick it up and line it up. Okay, looking good so far. Tapping that into place. slide this clutch hub back where it needs to be. It's looking good. We're on the home stretch now. The main shaft's in, input shaft's all good. The only thing left is the snap ring. You can do this before you put the main shaft in. It's totally up to you. So this is the larger snap ring that comes in your kit. So now just wrestle this little fella on there. Sometimes I think the snap rings are the hardest part of the whole install. There we go. So that's how you'll know your bearing's seated all the way. That snap ring should fit in there just right. Now we're gonna clean up this surface and get ready for the bearing retainer. The kit comes with a brand new bearing retainer that has the upgraded rubber seal style input shaft seal. So when you install this, make sure that your oil drain lines up with the oil drain on the case and that your clutch pivot ball is on the driver's side. Use the included gasket, which is cut out for the drain and the bolt holes, and just slide it all together. Put a little lubricant on the seal lip so it's not dry when it goes in, and reinstall with the original Allen head cap screws, and the kit comes with new little gaskets for the bolts. Always start these by hand. In addition to the supplied gasket washers, I put a little bit of thread sealant. I cleaned the threads with brake clean and put a little sealant on there because these transmissions have enough trouble keeping oil in them when everything's perfect, so we got to try to help them as much as possible. So I put a little lubricant on the bearing retainer, and now I'm sliding the original throwout bearing on the shaft. Install the spring. And I like to put a little extra on the clutch ball as well. And the front is good to go. That concludes the transmission case portion of the rebuild. So everything is done. Our locking tab is in place. So now it's really important that as we mount the transmission or the bell housing and transfer case, that we keep pressure in on this shaft. It's a good time to put a piece of wire around it and wire it up to the shifter, because we don't want everything falling back out. One thing I will say is when you put your shifter on and you're playing around with it, don't be alarmed if it doesn't feel like it's going in all the gears smoothly like you think it would. There's no oil in this, everything's new, nothing's kind of broken in yet. So I encourage you to, visually make sure it's all good and everything spins, but get some oil in it, get it together, get things spinning, and then start feeling with the shifter to make sure that everything's good, because just bench testing it isn't going to give you a real representation of how it's going to shift and feel. So just double check your work and then start putting it back together and getting it ready to go in the vehicle. Here it is installed with the bell housing and transfer case, ready to go back in the vehicle. Thank you for watching. Please let me know if you have any questions down in the comments. Be sure to use code REDEYEGARAGE10 at checkout when you buy your parts from KaiserWillys.com. It'll save you 10% on your next project.